Hello, my name is Anton Prakari, and I will be reading The Invasion of Panama by Noam Chomsky. And it's an excerpt from his book, What Uncle Sam Really Wants. That changed in 1968 when Omar Torrijos, a populist general, led a coup that allowed the black and mestizo mixed race poor to obtain at least a share of the power under Torrijos' military dictatorship in Panama. In 1981, Torrijos was killed in a plane crash. By 1983, the effective ruler was Manuel Noriega, a criminal who had been a cohort of Torrijos and U.S. intelligence. The U.S. government knew that Manuel Noriega was involved in drug trafficking since at least 1972, when the Nixon administration considered assassinating him, but he stayed on the CIA payroll. In 1983, a U.S. Senate committee concluded that Panama was a major center for the laundering of drug funds and drug trafficking. The U.S. government continued to value Noriega's services. In May 1986, the director of the Drug Enforcement Agency praised Noriega for his vigorous anti-drug trafficking policy. A year later, the director welcomed our close association with Noriega, while Attorney General Edwin Meese stopped a U.S. Justice Department investigation of Noriega's criminal activities. In August 1987, a Senate resolution condemning Noriega was opposed by Elliott Abrams, the State Department official in charge of U.S. policy in Central America and Panama. And yet, when Noriega was formally indicted in Miami in 1988, all the charges except one were related to activities that took place before 1984, back when he was our boy helping with the U.S. war against Nicaragua, stealing elections with U.S. approval, and generally serving U.S. interests satisfactorily. It had nothing to do with suddenly discovering that he was a gangster and a drug peddler that was well known all along. It's all quite predictable, as study after study shows. A brutal tyrant crosses the line from admirable villain to villain, and from admirable friend to villain and scum when he commits the crime of independence. One common mistake is going beyond robbing the poor, which is just fine, and to start interfering with the privileged, eliciting opposition from business leaders. By the mid 1980s, Noriega was guilty of these crimes. Among other things, he seems to have been dragging his feet about helping the U.S. in the Contra War. His independence also threatened our interests in the Panama Canal. On January 1st, 1990, most of the administration of the canal was due to go over to Panama in the year 2000. It goes completely to them. We had to make sure that Panama was in the hands of people we could control before that date. Since we could no longer trust Noriega to do our bidding, he had to go. Washington imposed economic sanctions that virtually destroyed the economy, the main burden falling on the poor non-white majority. They too came to hate Noriega, not least because he was responsible for the economic warfare, which was illegal if anyone cares, that was causing their children to starve. Next, a military coup was tried but failed. Then in December 1989, the U.S. celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War by invading Panama outright, killing hundreds or perhaps thousands of civilians. No one knows, and few north of the Rio Grande care enough to inquire. This restored power to the rich white elite that had been distracted by Torrijos' coup just in time to ensure a compliant government for the administrative changeover of the canal on January 1st, 1990. Throughout this process, the U.S. press followed Washington's lead, selecting villains in terms of current needs. Actions we'd formerly condoned became crimes. For example, in 1984, the Panamanian presidential election had been won by Arnulfo Arias. The election was stolen by Manuel Noriega with considerable violence and fraud. But Noriega hadn't yet become disobedient. He was our man in Panama, and as the area's party was considered to have dangerous elements of ultranationalism. The Reagan administration therefore applauded the violence and fraud and sent Secretary of State George Shultz down to legitimate the stolen election and praised Noriega's version of democracy as a model for the errant Sandinistas. The Washington Media Alliance and the major journals refrained from criticizing the fraudulent elections, but dismissed as utterly worthless the Sandinistas' far more free and honest election in the same year, because it could not be controlled. In May 1989, Noriega again stole an election, this time from a representative of the business opposition, Guillermo Endara. Noriega used less violence than in 1984, but the Reagan administration had given the signal that it had turned against Noriega. Following the predictable script, the press expressed outrage over his failure to meet our lofty democratic standards. The press also began passionately denouncing human rights violations that previously didn't reach the threshold of their attention. By the time we invaded Panama in December 1989, the press had demonized Manuel Noriega, turning him to the worst monster since Attila the Hun. It was basically a replay of the demonization of Gaddafi of Libya. Ted Koppel was orating that Noriega belongs to that special fraternity of international villains, men like Gaddafi, Idi Amin, and the Ayatollah Khomeini, whom Americans just love to hate. Dan Rather placed him at the top of the list of the world's drugs, thieves, and scums. In fact, Noriega remained a minor thug, exactly what he was when he was on the CIA payroll. In 1988, for example, America's Watch published a report on human rights in Panama, giving an unpleasant picture. But as the reports and other inquiries make clear, Noriega's human rights record was nothing remotely like that of other U.S. clients in the region, and no worse than in the days when Noriega was still a favorite, following orders. Take Honduras, for example. Although it's not a murderous terrorist state like El Salvador or Guatemala, human rights abuses were probably worse there in Honduras than in Panama. In fact, there's one CIA-trained battalion in Honduras that all by itself had carried out more atrocities than Noriega did. Or consider U.S.-backed dictators like Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, Somoza in Nicaragua, Marcos in the Philippines, Duvalier in Haiti, and a host of Central American gangsters through the 1980s. They're all much more brutal than Noriega, but the United States supported them enthusiastically right through decades of horrifying atrocities, as long as the profits were flowing out of their countries and into the U.S. George Bush's administration continued to honor Mobutu, Ceausescu, and Saddam Hussein, among others, all far worse criminals than Noriega. Suharto of Indonesia, arguably the worst killer of them all, remains a Washington media moderate. In fact, at exactly the moment it invaded Panama because of its outrage over Noriega's abuse of human rights, the Bush administration announced a new high-technology sales to China, noting that $300 million in business for U.S. firms was at stake, and the contacts had secretly resumed a few weeks after the Tiananmen Square massacre. On the same day that Panama was invaded, the White House also announced plans and implemented them shortly afterwards to lift a ban on loans to Iraq. The State Department explained with a straight face that this was to achieve a goal of increasing U.S. exports and to put us in a better position to deal with Iraq regarding its human rights record. The department continued with the pose as Bush rebuffed the Iraqi Democratic opposition and blocked congressional efforts to condemn the atrocity crimes of his old friend Saddam Hussein. Compared to Bush's buddies in Baghdad and Beijing, Noriega looked like Mother Teresa. After the invasion, Bush announced $1 billion in aid to Panama. Of this, $400 million consisted of incentives for U.S. business to export products to Panama. $150 million was to pay off bank loans, and $65 million went to private sector loans and guarantees to U.S. investors. In other words, about half the aid was a gift from the American taxpayer to American businesses. The U.S. put the bankers back in power after the invasion. Noriega's involvement in drug trafficking had been trivial compared to theirs. Drug trafficking in Panama has always been conducted primarily by the banks. The banking system is virtually unregulated, so it's a natural outlet for criminal money. This has been the basis for Panama's highly artificial economy and remains so, possibly at a higher level after the invasion. The Panamanian defense forces have also been reconstructed with basically the same officers. In general, everything's pretty much the same, only now more reliable servants are in charge. The same is true of Grenada, which has become a major center of drug money laundering since the U.S. invasion. Nicaragua, too, has become a significant conduit for drugs to the U.S. market, after Washington's victory in the 1990 election. The pattern is standard, as is the failure to notice it.